Hello again, folks. We are going to get started, and I am sitting here with Ann Mordecai, my colleague, and Mike Schwartz is around. And I'm welcoming David Williams and Christopher Thibault today, two educators at Belmont High School. David Williams is the principal there, and Chris Thibault is the associate principal, and the two of them have been charged with transitioning their high school to competency-based learning, and they're going to share their experience with you today. Dave Williams was, I actually worked with David Williams in York, where he was the principal of the York Middle School, and he transitioned his school or worked on that process in York. And Chris Thibault was in Rochester last year and gained a lot of experience there with competency-based education and the work that went on at Rochester. So they're here today to share their experiences with you, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions. I'm encouraging you to write your questions in, and I will be monitoring the questions and stopping the presentation periodically so that Dave and Chris can answer your questions. That's about it, so I'm going to hand it over to them. And welcome, David and Chris.
Okay, thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Yep. As Karen said, folks, this is a very broad topic, and I think it's almost difficult to do something this broad in a webinar so that all attendees get what they need out of it. It's really important. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please write them in, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. We realize that every school is at a different place with this. And every school needs something a little bit different. What we want to do really is share our experiences with you. We've learned a lot. We've done this process. I've done it in Maine and New Hampshire at the middle and high school levels.
And I've done it at Spalding as a teacher in the classroom during their transition.
So we have a lot of things to share. What we want you to get out of the presentation, we want to identify the goals for the transition. We feel as though sometimes these overarching goals, why schools are engaging in this work, sometimes can be lost. We're definitely going to introduce a timeline for the transition. It's the actual timeline that we created for Belmont High School, and we'll share with you what went into that and why we chose to write our timeline the way we did.
And we're going to review some common mistakes and misconceptions. I think a lot of schools are doing this work very differently, and I think as schools do this work, that they run into challenges and barriers, a lot of which that Dave and I have faced and seen now we're both in our second or third transition. We're also going to emphasize teaching and learning. I think this is going to be a cornerstone of this presentation. Really, when you talk about competency-based education, teaching and learning has to be at the forefront.
Exactly, and I think that is what's unique about our approach really is the emphasis on teaching and learning. If we think of the overarching goals, why schools engage in this work, why we want to transition to competency-based teaching and learning, first the goal is to improve learning outcomes for all students. We want to make sure we increase achievement. And this is true for our students who struggle, and it's just as true for our students who excel at school. The other side of it is to improve the accuracy and integrity of our grading and reporting systems. And I think schools have to be honest in the fact that our traditional systems are flawed. And they're inaccurate in a number of ways, and part of this work is to make sure that they are accurate. Our achievement data must be accurate. And we present this slide first, and we focus on it a little bit because in the schools that I've worked in and the schools that I've observed, oftentimes when school leaders, whether it's building level administrators or district level administrators, are pressed with difficult questions, often from the community, about why we are moving away from the traditional grade scale, why are we doing this work. Oftentimes I've heard, especially in the state of Maine, well, it's a state mandate. And that may not be completely true in New Hampshire. The state of Maine actually has legislation that does mandate a proficiency-based diploma. And sometimes we revert to that, well, we have to do it. And then it becomes about compliance. And I think compliance is a lousy motivator. I think it's a lousy motivator for kids, and it's definitely a lousy motivator for adults. So we really want to make sure that at every point in this work, we focus on the overarching goals. And really this work represents the most widely accepted and compelling research in our field. And, in a lot of ways, I think schools would be irresponsible if they weren't implementing some of these practices.
And oftentimes, schools can get so caught up in the operational side of this transition, the things that parents actually see, that they lose sight of, these two overarching goals. It's about students. And it's about changing the way that teachers educate in the classroom. And the operational stuff, it's super important, and communicating to parents is essential. But if nothing changes in the classroom, then really competency-based education is no different than anything we've done before.
Right. So we think to help illustrate this idea, it's sometimes helpful to think about competency-based education as consisting of two realms. We have teaching and learning on one side, and we have grading and reporting on the other side. And in the vast majority of schools, and those of you who have begun this work probably find this in your schools as well, most schools place 90% or more of the emphasis on grading and reporting, and very little emphasis on teaching and learning. At the end of the day, this is about teaching and learning. It's about being clear with students what they're expected to know and be able to do, having criteria for success, providing feedback to students, providing opportunities for students to self-assess. These are the kind of things that are going to have an impact on student learning, that first goal. That second goal, that's more of an operational piece.
Yeah, and so that's the stuff that people get focused on, is that operational side of it. Here at Belmont, I really think we're taking a unique approach to this. Instead of putting 10% of the emphasis on teaching and learning and 90% on grading and reporting, we're really starting with the classroom. We're flipping that, and we're asking teachers to change their practice before we take a systems approach, before we change some of our operations.
Correct. So what we propose to do is flip that emphasis, place 90% of the emphasis on teaching and learning, 10% on grading and reporting. It's something in my experience, I've experienced at both the middle and high school levels. When I was in York, when I came on as principal first year, I was told that the very next year we were going to transition to a proficiency-based report card. Same thing here in Belmont. In Belmont, we actually began reporting on a 4-point scale with our freshman class last year. And we slowed that down because there was so much work that was done on designing the report card, and there was a conversion scale that was put in place to convert the 100-point scale to the 4-point scale, with almost no work done on teaching and learning. And that really is putting the cart before the horse. You can't and you should not attempt to have a competency-based grading and reporting model without a competency-based teaching and learning model in place first.
And so one of the things that we came in immediately doing was expecting teachers to change their practice in the classroom, or at least to begin looking at the impetus behind competency-based education and really examining the outcomes for themselves so that they understand it. It's really about building consensus and buy-in at the ground level by having teachers a part of the process instead of shifting operations for teachers.
Yeah. And a big piece of this, another common issue that we see is copycat implementation. It's absolutely critical to understand that what works in one school or district, even if they have, it's evidence-based and they've seen some success, you simply cannot take that program and plop it into your school or your district and expect it to work, because every school has a different context in which this work should be considered. And that's one of the big pieces. What we share with you today, we don't expect that our steps and our timeline would work in your schools. Hopefully it will it'll help to generate some ideas about how to go about it. If you think about the factors to consider, every school and every district has different teacher attitude and aptitudes towards this work, different building and district level leadership in terms of the school leaders' understanding of how to do this work, different student demographics, community values and resources, budget constraints, personnel, scheduling, on and on. There is no one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, so I've seen other schools trying to imitate or copy what we did at Spalding. And the reason we caution against that is because all of those factors are different in every single school. So, the way that you approach the change to teaching and learning and the way you build in your operations is going to be very different. I think schools run the risk of failing in this transition if they just take a packaged approach to competency-based education.
Yeah. So the way we began in Belmont, really, it started with one-on-one interviews of every staff member. That's every teacher, every paraprofessional, everybody in the building that has contact with kids. And we sort of surveyed them in an interview style for, what their experience was, what their attitudes and beliefs around competency-based teaching and learning was, what professional development they had. And what we found in Belmont is that there had been very little school-wide professional learning. We didn't really have a shared understanding of competency-based education. We found a lot of misconception and inconsistency throughout our staff. We had widespread inconsistencies in all aspects of curriculum instruction and assessment. We actually found that there were multiple conversion scales being used, an attempt to convert the 100-point scale to a 4-point scale. And, that in and of itself was a red flag to us, because if you really understand what you want to do with competency-based teaching and learning, there is no conversion. We had reporting tools that were not configured properly to report out in a competency-based system, and there was very little operational criteria identified, things like GPA, class rank.
Yeah, that's something that's super important to emphasize. When we came into Belmont, they had flipped about half the school to working on this 4-point scale without building a shared vision and a sense of what that actually meant. So some teachers were reporting out on a 4-point scale without really knowing why, and making that conversion from the 100-point scale to the 4-point scale. And that goes back to our overarching goals. You really have to build in a sense of why we're doing this and what this work means at the classroom level before you can flip the switch on GPA, class rank, eligibility, etc.
Correct.
I have a question about, someone has written in about how you sort of built that background knowledge. Are there authors or folks that you regularly go to that that schools or readings that you recommend that helped you to sort of build a common understanding in your building?
Yeah, so we get asked this question from time to time, and I don't think there are any authors, and I don't think there's any research that you're going to be able to point to that will support the efficacy of competency-based teaching and learning on student outcomes. You're not going to find that piece of it. I think what you have to go is you have to take a look at each component. So we look at authors like Carol Dweck when we talk about mindset. We look at Angela Duckworth and we talk about teaching and building in perseverance and grit. Let's see, we have Rick Wormley, I think, is outstanding when you want to talk about how to differentiate instruction. Him and Carol Ann Tomlinson. You look at Marzano when you talk about student assessment. I think you have to really you have to pick from all the great research that's out there. Daniel Pink, when you want to talk about student motivation, a lot of the objection that you'll get from community, especially around some of the grading practices. We're going to remove zeros, so on and so forth. You get, well, that destroys motivation. We know that's not true, and where you're going to have your basis for your argument is through the work of Daniel Pink, his book Drive. So there are a number of titles. I could go on and on. You can look at Thomas Guskey. You can look at Doug Reeves. He talks about and writes about toxic grading practices. So I think you have to look at the body of research that's in our field, both in curriculum, instruction, in assessment, in motivation, motivational psychology. And that's really how we began. In York, we did a number of shared reads. We offered these books off. I'm a big John Hattie fan. We refer a lot to John Hattie and his work. We've studied his work very carefully. And John Hattie wrote a great book called Visible Learning. And in that book, he really essentially ranks educational interventions based on what he calls effect size. And so we really study the strategies that are going to give us the most bang for the buck, that have been demonstrated to have the most effect on student learning. And those are the kind of things that we emphasize. And this is connected to our central premise, really, that we're focusing on teaching and learning. And, even outside of a school that's transitioning to competency-based teaching and learning, we know that it's good practice to identify whether you call them learning targets or essential outcomes, learning goals, whatever vernacular you're using in your district. It's important that teachers begin by identifying what they want students to know and be able to do. It's important that kids understand what success criteria is for those targets. It's critical that we provide meaningful, actionable feedback to students that it is used to drive instruction. This is just good practice. It's important that we differentiate for kids that are struggling and kids that are excelling in school. These are things that we've been talking about in school for years, and none of that has changed. And what we really do is focus around that, and we have conversations like this as we work to build that shared vision.
And when we talk about cultivating that shared understanding, that really has to come first. And it's going to be, the way to do that is different in every building, and that work is never really done. When we came into Belmont, one of the first things we did was slow down, because we found that about half of our teachers were embracing this work and moving forward with it, and the other half really didn't understand it. So when you talk about a shared, it really needs to be a general shared vision with everybody for why we're doing the work and what this work means. I would caution against selecting a group of the teacher leaders and designating them your transition experts. It's got to be the building. It's got to be together. Ideally, it's everyone.
Yeah, and I think it has to be also reflected in the way building leaders evaluate their staff. That's an important piece of this as well. When we present an idea at whether it's a workshop day or at a staff meeting, we make sure that we follow up that week with classroom visits where we're not necessarily evaluating teachers, but we're giving them non-evaluative feedback, really coaching. We understand as educators the value of non-evaluative feedback to student performance. You have to realize that the same thing holds true to staff and how we coach our staff around a transition like this. We're going to... Go ahead, Karen.
I have another question.
Sure.
Someone wrote in about how do you this I think you're going to address a little bit later, but how do you differentiate between competency-based versus standards-based, or is it just semantics?
Well,
so if you want to answer that now, then go ahead, but if you know that you're coming to that, then that's okay too.
We'll definitely come to it, and before I click to the timeline, I'll give you the quick answer is there is no difference. Competency-based teaching and learning is really high-quality standards-based teaching and learning, and again, we will go into that a little bit deeper. We'll share the timeline. Chris is going to resize it a bit so you can see it better. We won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but we did want you to see the format that we used when we created the timeline for Belmont High School. This is the actual timeline that we use with our staff. Let Chris resize it here. And let's take a look. Hopefully you can see that. Is that okay for sizing, Karen?
Looks good.
Okay.
That's better.
An important piece to note about this timeline, and I think when schools, at the right point, once you've had time to really create that shared vision and you assess where you are and what the needs of your school, I think a timeline is important. I think it's important for the staff. I think it's important for the community to understand where you're headed. This was only built. When we came in July as a new principal, new admin team, we were asked by the school board to write a timeline for the transition, and I pushed back on that a little bit. And what I said was, we can't do that right now. We can't do that without spending months in the building, working with staff, observing teachers, understanding where we were in the process before we could do this. So what you're seeing now, this is actually a working draft of our timeline that we will plan to finalize in the spring. And in the spring, I will make a presentation to the board along with the community on the timeline. So this is a draft, but as we've gone through the year, we feel like the things we have in there make sense, and we believe it's going to be the final timeline.
And just to jump in, this is all hard work to do. There's no one who has this all figured out. There's no one right way for it. There's no manual that prescribes exactly how to do this work. But it comes with professional development. It comes with cultivating a shared vision that teachers really buy into. The bottom line is hopefully everyone wants to do what's best for kids. And if we can communicate this, if school leadership can communicate this as what's best for kids, I think ultimately people will jump on board and people will be excited about it and they'll work for it.
That's true. And before we switch, we have slides that we can highlight. We will highlight individual bullets. If you notice on the 2016-2017 column, though, once we get into that, virtually all of those bullets, those are things that we begin this first year, our first year here with the school in the transition, but they continue throughout the life of the transition and even beyond. That's an important piece to note.
And if you look at the operational side of it, we shared in the beginning that our focus is primarily teaching and learning. Our operational changes, they're in 2018, 2019. That's a full 3 years into our transition.
Correct. And we even have, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but we have a rule here with our staff that nobody is allowed to ask any questions about the report card, what the report card or what the transcript is going to look like this year. They're not allowed to do it. We're focusing on teaching and learning. The bullets that you see in red, the reason that we colored them in red, we did that only for our last staff meeting, because these are either things that are having a substantial impact on the work of our teachers now, or they will next year, and things we wanted to prepare our staff for. So we really targeted our professional development around what you see in red. One other thing I want to point out before we go to the next slide, the very last bullet, that is the only bullet this year that has a significant impact on the work of teachers in the classroom, clearly articulating and communicating learning targets to students and families. And the reason is we believe that teachers, I don't believe it, I know it, teachers can begin using learning targets and work towards using them at a high level at any point in their teaching. They do not have to have clearly defined competencies. They don't have to have standards with proficiency scales or scoring guides. All we've asked teachers to do is do nothing to your grading practices. We want to assess where you're at with that. But when you begin any unit or any lesson, make sure you're clear with kids about what you want them to know and be able to do. And that is an expectation of our staff. Every student in our building is expected to be able to articulate a direct connection between the work they have in front of them and the desired outcome. So when we do our classroom observations and our walkthroughs, we want to make sure kids know what learning targets they're working on, where they are in relation to those targets, and what success will look like when they hit those targets. And that's where we've begun this work. I think many other schools begin with the grading and reporting side of it, and we find that problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's where we've seen some success. We're going to move back to the slideshow now, but just to point out, one of the things coming in here, being through this transition a couple times, the main difference is the impact that we're having at the classroom level, with seeing classroom teachers who are putting these targets on the board and really beyond that, expecting that their students know not what they're learning, but why they're learning it. And that's having a direct impact in our classrooms.
That will have an immediate impact. So our year one steps, we've summarized what we've had in our timeline. This first one about the open community forums, I think they're absolutely critical. And you have to be able to do it in a way that you can have candid discussion where participants can ask the tough questions and you can engage in that dialogue with the community, honestly, and with staff as well. We do that both in formal presentations, and we also do what we call coffee with the principals. We have those monthly, and we vary the times that we have those coffees. And they have been very well attended, did them both in Maine and here, and that's a great way to get the message out to parents and allow parents really in an informal setting. We sit on tables, we have some snacks, and we just engage, we just talk to the parents about it. We'll let them share their concerns, and it's really been great.
Yeah, it has been. And to return to some of the barriers and challenges that I think we've seen, communicating with parents is amongst the biggest. When we talk about this transition, it's something different from them, and they'll could be against it. They could be even downright hostile to it. So it's so important that the communication comes certainly from school leadership into how this impacts students in the classroom, but that the message is with teachers too. So if teachers see parents in the grocery store, or if they have an email exchange, that the message is consistent. From our school community to the community at large.
Yep. That second bullet about fostering a culture, that is a staff culture of inquiry. I can't stress this one enough. This is how we communicate to our staff. As teachers, we are professional educators. And really, this is an academic endeavor. And I believe as professional educators, we should approach it that way. So we make sure that we are regularly reviewing research, we're discussing it, we're applying it to our practice, we're reflecting on that, and then we're improving what we do. You have to establish that culture in your buildings, either before or as you transition. And I think sometimes this transition can actually be a great catalyst for fostering that kind of environment in a school. The piece about developing a shared language, absolutely critical. In this building, we could have polled 10 teachers, and we would have got 10 different definitions or ideas, conceptions of what a competency was. Are we talking about competencies? Are we grading and assessing competencies, or are we grading and assessing standards? You have standards, learning targets, learning goals. We've heard measurement topics, learning objectives. It's scoring guide, proficiency scale. I could go on and on. It's critical that you have a shared language. And we will, I think at the end of this slide, we'll go and we'll show you the language that we landed on and how we defined them. But to be clear, we don't believe that the vernacular that we've chosen is any better than anyone else's, but you have to define it, and you've got to stick to it. And all stakeholders need to understand what that language is, from your students to central office administration, parents, and community members. And we really we hammer that. Once we decided on what the language is going to be moving forward, you have to stick to it. The piece about engaging students in their transition, I think that's often lost. And I think that can make the difference between a successful transition and one that ultimately fails or that gets delayed. There isn't any other stakeholder that's affected more than this work than the students. And I think it's important that not only teachers are engaging them in dialogue about what they're doing, share their practice, share the instructional approach with kids, let them know, I'm doing this because of this. We're hoping this has an influence on your learning. Get feedback from kids.
So just one thing in relation to that, when we've had teachers post these learning targets on the board, we've had them use I can statements, in part because we want to let students know that when they see something that says I can, well, that means that is their learning target for the day. And we have informal conversations with students all the time about this transition to really engage them.
Exactly right. If we cover something with our staff, then we'll meet with students in small groups and cover the same material so kids are hearing it. And the way
I have a question, Dave, when you have a moment. That was actually the question. And are you directly, as the school leaders, engaging students?
Absolutely. 100%. And typically with teachers present. And to be quite honest, a piece of this work is, as a school leader, you have to be able to change teacher behavior, and there are a lot of ways to do that. We do it through mostly, coaching and motivation, that kind of thing, but there are also some other things that we do. And one of those is, at a staff meeting, we may present something about just for simply learning targets. Here's how we expect them to be used. Here's how you do it at a high level. Here's what we want to see in the classroom. Then we'll follow up with the same message to kids. We have a time during the day where we can access students in small groups or large groups. So oftentimes we'll bring the kids in and we'll share the same professional learning, really, only at the student level. And then the third prong to that, I do a weekly email blast out to our parents, and I always share the professional work that's happening in the school. It's never about dates and games and plays and things like that. Maybe it should be a little bit more, but I really target my message to parents on the professional work that's happening in the building, what they should see and hear coming home from their kids. So in a sense, now we have teachers holding students accountable. We have students and parents holding the teachers accountable. And really, that's how it should work. And both in Maine and now here in Belmont, I found some success doing it that way.
And that's even as specific as telling parents that they should see learning targets. At our last coffee with the principal, we made that clear to parents that the expectation is for teachers to be communicating to students exactly what they want them to know and be able to do. And you should see that. You should be able to ask your son or daughter, what was your learning target today? And they should respond.
The question about do building level administrators actually deliver that message to kids? The answer is yes, and I think it's imperative that building level administrators have a deep, deep understanding of this work, both a philosophical understanding and a pedagogical understanding. They must be able to provide the instructional leadership that teachers need and that teachers crave. And that's an important piece. And I encourage building level administrators, if they don't feel 100% confident in this work, to seek out professional development. Talk to other school leaders who have done the work and understand it, because that piece is critical.
Because no one understands the factors and the considerations around your school better than you do. And I think that's an important piece, too, for buy-in. I think faculty and staff will be engaged at a much higher level in this transition if the message is coming from those in the building who work with them every day.
Correct. And then the last bullet I want to address on this particular slide is the one about professional development opportunities. The school and district have to be willing to invest financial resources here, because if you believe it's that important, if you truly believe it's going to have an impact on student learning, you have to be able to invest financially. But there are some wonderful things you can do that are free or of little cost. And I think, as I reflect on my growth as a school leader, particularly in this work, the single most powerful piece of professional development I've done is to engage in reciprocal school visits. And that can be done at any time, and it's free. When I was working in Maine, I visited many, many schools. We hosted many schools in our building. At this point now, I've visited schools all over the state of Maine, New Hampshire, many in Massachusetts, even California. And you learn so much from spending time in other schools and engaging in candid discussion with teachers, with building leaders. And, we'll put this out there now, is that, any school who wants to come here and visit us and meet with our teachers, see the work we're doing, share our documents, that is an open invitation. And we would just ask that we could also pay a visit to your schools, because we learn from everyone. You don't have to be doing this at a high level to learn from it. And we're not claiming that we have a perfect model either. We have a lot of growth to do, and we learn from these reciprocal visits. Because we had a question about shared language, I think we'll go to that now. We are prepared to do that before we go to year 2 steps. And again, if folks have questions, feel free to again, send them our way.
These were definitions that were made at the district level this year. So going into this transition, our district didn't define competency standard and learning target. And we sat down with everyone at the start of the year and said, this is really the first step, so that we're all speaking the same language.
Correct. And the 3 big ones that we defined in our work were competency, standard, and learning target. And this is where I think the state of New Hampshire has made a bit of a mistake in terms of their definition of competency and what schools do with competencies. So for us, competencies only exist for reporting purposes. They are simply categories. Categories under which all of our standards are organized. So we don't believe you can measure a competency. It's far too broad. And so our competencies, again, they're simply categories under which our standards are organized. We measure at the standard level.
And that's something that not every school is doing. Like we said earlier, different schools are using these terms, especially competency, to mean very different things. And that's true of Spalding. I'm sure it's true of a lot of your schools as well.
So really what we focus mostly on are our standards. And our standards, the definition that we've landed on, a non-negotiable, measurable objective that guides instruction. And we think this is important because schools have been using standards for many, many, many years. And for years, the expectation of teachers is that they clearly define success criteria for each standard. We believe that nothing has changed about that. The only thing that has changed in this state is that we've added the term competency. So we've decided to use competencies only as broad categories under which we organize our standards. From our standards, we have learning targets. We spoke a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if we talk about the way these connect with each other, like Dave said, that we're using competencies for reporting. We have 9 to 15 standards per course that roll up into that competency. But at the classroom level, we're really emphasizing learning targets. And this is, again, where we began. This is our expectation that teachers are communicating to students exactly what we want them to know and be able to do. Now typically, these are connected to standards. So there could be 50 learning targets per standard. There could be 30, there could be 10, depending on the standard. We have them in I can statements. But what's interesting is that they don't necessarily have to be connected to standards. I did an observation the other day where one of our teachers was using learning targets as the goal for students to be able to access their online grading portal. So her learning target was I can access web to school, and we think that's awesome. Another thing about learning targets is they're student-facing. These are the things that students see that they need to be able to understand. It's essential that learning targets are attached to each lesson, to every assignment, and that they're accessible so that a student at the end of his class or her class can reflect on learning for the day. I guess one of our biggest pushes has been to make class less about the activity and more about the learning itself.
Exactly right. And we chose to use I can statements. We use them consistently. You'll find them in every classroom in this building without exception. We don't necessarily believe they need to be written in I can statements. We do that for consistency. We feel that it helps with the transition. There's some positive peer pressure when every staff member knows they're going to see them. And it also makes a difference with kids, especially in the early stages of implementation, where you have students, they can go into any classroom and they know that they're going to see an I can statement. They know that that is the learning target. But we don't believe that they need to be written in I can form necessarily. I just think that it does help with consistency, especially in early implementation.
I have a couple of questions that have come in.
Sure.
So, one is a clarification, and it says, to clarify, we measure and report on the standards, not the targets, correct?
Well, that's an awesome question. And let me think about how I want to answer that. So we actually report on both in a sense. So in terms of reporting on the report card, we report at the standard level and the competency level. Really, it's the standard level in the online portal only and the competency level on the report card. I don't think you can have a report card that lists out all the standards. It just becomes too unwieldy. There's too much there. So we sort of roll them up. But a teacher at the classroom level is assessing individual learning targets for sure. Learning targets are derived from your success criteria for your standard. And
right, so I guess this is a good time to jump in and say one of the things that we're expecting teachers to do this year to work with is developing proficiency scales.
Yeah.
So basically they're taking their standards and they're setting out a list of criteria, literally describing that standard, what they expect students to do to be proficient, to know and be able to do. These are not student-facing documents. These are for teachers to drive instruction and develop their learning targets. Another way learning targets are assessed really is through rubrics, right? They grade the learning targets. So yeah, I guess we can go and show one of these proficiency scales now.
Is this the blank? No.
This
Okay.
one's filled in.
There's a lot of words on this, and we understand that it may be difficult to see. I'll try to zoom in a little bit, but this is directly connected to that question, and this is an important question. Before I delve too deep into it, I want to make sure that folks understand this question is connected to grading and reporting, where we want to, and it bridges both, the teaching and learning side. So we call these proficiency scales. This is what we use to assess our students in our classes here. This is one that was just written the other day. We're building these currently. So we've asked every teacher in the building for each course they teach to identify the standards that they're going to teach in those courses. And you can see that here on the proficiency scale. The competency, the broad category that this is grouped under, is matter and its interactions. And again, each course has approximately 3 to 5 competencies, perhaps 10 or 15 standards within those competencies. And a couple of things you may want to notice, and I'm sure this is going to generate some questions. We don't have numbers on this proficiency scale. This is not a rubric, and it's an important distinction to make. And I think a lot of schools make either what they call scoring guides or proficiency scales, and they include numbers on them, and they attempt to assess student work with these documents. we don't use these as student-facing documents, and we don't believe proficiency scales or scoring guides should ever be used to assess a single piece of student work. They may be used to assess a body of work, to make an evidence-based claim on student learning at the end of an instructional unit, but not to assess particular assignments. When we wrote these, what we asked teachers to do for every standard you teach, identify what proficiency looks like. What is the criteria that you will accept to make a claim that a student is proficient in a given standard? And this is a complex one for high school chemistry. We have some that are much simpler that we can share with you for other subject areas. The question about learning targets. Our learning targets are then derived from this proficiency scale. So a learning target for this one, perhaps here, could be I can describe particle behavior according to kinetic theory. We wanted to steer away from some schools are actually embedding learning targets into documents like this. We are steering away from that. We believe, we value academic freedom for one, and the teacher in the classroom is the one who has the expertise both in the content area and hopefully their students. And we want to promote differentiation as much as we can. So, for any given standard, two students in the same classroom could have two different learning targets that they're working on. So teachers use this for instructional planning. Once they've identified their learning targets, they may have rubrics designed for those individual assessments, or maybe an assessment that doesn't require a rubric. And over time, the course of the unit, whether it's a 2-week unit, a 4-week unit, that teacher essentially is building evidence and compiling evidence on student learning against this criteria.
And so I think one thing important to point out about these is they're living documents. They're not set in stone. Teachers don't finish them. As they teach a unit of study, as they go over a standard, they're changing these. They're re-examining exactly what proficient means, and we expect that these will get more precise as teachers go.
Them aren't this verbose for sure. One thing you'll note again, I think I mentioned there are no numbers, but intuitively you know that what we have for the proficient criteria, when it comes time that we are forced to add a number to a grade book, that is the 3, the 4 being the advanced. We early on, we found it somewhat problematic when we had the numbers on the proficiency scale, both for staff and for kids, really, because I think the natural instinct is to equate that number with some number on the 100-point scale. Is a 3 a 90? Is it a 95? Is a 4 100? We wanted to get away from that, and we wanted to get away from ranking and really classifying work. Oftentimes we've seen this done where teachers will say, well, this is 3 work, this is 2 work, this is 4 work. We wanted to get away from that. What is the criteria for success? And what do we want kids to learn at a high level in order to be considered proficient?
And even though these are certainly not used for assessment or for grading, we have teachers in this building who are communicating the descriptors to students and really giving them feedback about where they are based on all of the evidence, based on a body of work that they've received from that student.
Other questions, Karen? Or should we keep going?
Well, I have a question. So between different courses, and I actually was answering a question and problem solving for a second, so if you address this, just tell me. In terms of consistency between courses, courses like geometry, let's say, at what level is consistency mandated in the building? Do you know what I mean? Is it at
Yep.
Is it at the?
That is at the standard
Okay.
level. So we have multiple teachers teaching geometry. Those teachers use the exact set of standards for their geometry courses and the same proficiency scale, so that proficiency criteria is going to be the same if you're in one teacher's classroom or if you're another. How the teacher chooses to help you to meet that criteria, their instructional approach, that's up to them, providing that if they're going to make a claim that a student is proficient in a geometry standard, the student has met this criteria, and that criteria is the same from classroom to classroom.
Really, the autonomy comes at the classroom level where teachers build their own learning targets, where they decide what their students should know and be able to do within a given lesson. And those are built directly from those common proficiency scales.
And are assessments built from the proficiency scales or from the targets? Do you insist on the building on common assessments for, let's say, 10th grade, geometry?
We are not at that point with common assessments yet. I would envision us getting to that point down the road. But right now, we're really focusing on the individual teacher. They would build those assessments really from both.
Both. Yeah.
But oftentimes, it's going to be the learning target level.
Okay. Just curious to know the plan, the thinking forward, what it would look like.
It depends on the standard. There are some assessments where a teacher is going to be able to assess multiple standards with one assessment. And there are certainly many assessments where a teacher will be able to assess multiple learning targets. Sometimes teachers are able to assess learning targets anecdotally. And we have a lot of teachers that are able to do that through just informal, formative assessments, conversations with students. In the teacher's professional judgment, the student has met criteria for particular individual learning targets. We're looking for something a little bit more concrete when we're making that claim about the standard level. So moving forward with year 2, we're just going to highlight a couple of these bullets. The ones that you see in red, again, they're red because those are things that are having an impact on our school, on our teachers. These are things that we hope to implement next year, but we begin talking about now. One of the big hang-ups when you talk about ineffective or toxic grading practices, this is difficult for a lot of folks to swallow. It's very difficult for the community, and it's difficult for some teachers to understand how these practices essentially make their achievement data, their grades, less accurate. So things like giving zeros, things like taking points off for late work, things like extra credit. And, the important piece, I think, when schools do this work and you attempt to remove those grading practices is that you have to remember, at the same time, what must go hand in hand with that are clear reassessment policies and also some way to grade what we call habits of work and learning, habits of work, habits of mind, sometimes they're called, because the reality is we still want to directly teach work ethic. We want to promote a strong work ethic. And the reality is we do need some sort of accountability, particularly at the high school level where we have academic eligibility for sports, for clubs, and we attach that to our habits of work. Those need to be meaningful, and they need to be easy to assess. Oftentimes, I think they become way too complex in schools, and they become very difficult for teachers to actually assess on a regular basis.
And this is really where communication to parents is essential. If the message from teachers, from school leadership isn't consistent around relearning and reassessment practices and habits of work and learning, there can be this sense that competency-based education means no due dates, or competency-based education means you can make something up as many times as you want with no restrictions. And certainly that's not the case. That's why schools have to be crystal clear on structures for reassessment, for relearning, for eligibility. That's where those operational things come in. But they don't come in until you've developed a shared understanding in the classroom with why you're doing this work, because the danger is teachers can have these misconceptions too. And when they do and communicate these to parents, well, they start equating competency-based education with a 4-point scale or with no due dates or any of those things.
Correct. Oftentimes the perception is we're lowering our standards. Kids don't have to study anymore. They can always redo the test, or they don't have to turn in their homework. Homework's not counting anymore. There are no due dates. There are no deadlines anymore. And nothing could be further from the truth. We believe in deadlines. We believe in having hard due dates. But we also believe in sound reassessment practices for students. We believe in having strong habits of work that are directly taught and promoted and assessed, and kids have an opportunity to reflect on. Those are important pieces. It doesn't always have to be this world where kids can turn anything in at any time, turn in shoddy work and be able to redo it without some sort of criteria put in place. These things are important to have in place, both for effective implementation and also to satisfy the needs of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it goes back to the bottom line is toxic grading practices. You never want to have anything that makes the grade of the student's grade less accurate. So let's say a student missed class for a day and didn't get the work done. Well, traditionally, a teacher may put a 0 in, and that grade may average with 10 other grades and bring that grade down, but it really doesn't change what a student knows and is able to do. That's why it's so essential in this transition that you have clear habits of work and learning, and those are separated from our grading practices, grading the academic work.
That's a great point. That's actually a point we use a lot with some of our traditional teachers, is that this really is a more scientific approach. And there's a shift in thinking that has to happen. We're not grading students anymore. Instead, we're making evidence-based claims on the work they produce based on clear criteria that we've established. So when I say we're not grading anymore, we're certainly not grading based on some mathematical algorithm that would have any number of variables. We've established clear criteria, and we are making evidence-based claims on what students have or have not learned. And so what we tell teachers as they reflect, and we're doing a lot of self-reflective activities this year, particularly on grading practices, is you need to examine your grading practices and identify anything that's going to make your achievement data any less accurate. Our grades must be accurate. They must. Not turning in work is a behavior. Poor performance could be a reflection of academics, but not turning in work, things like that, those are behaviors. Those need to be assessed separate from the academics. That's a central piece of this.
Yeah, and really, this is the part that's the big shift. This is the paradigm shift. The idea that grades aren't based on a mathematical calculation of the work you've turned in. It's evidence-based. It's an examination of only the work that the students have done in relation to the criteria that's pre-established. I mean, that's a big shift in schools.
If we move to year 3 of our transition plan, we'll begin to actually distinguish between academic standards and habits of work in our reporting. So the year prior, we identify what those habits of work are going to be, work on the rubrics, how are we going to assess them, and then finally we'll begin differentiating between the two. Implementing a schedule with embedded reteaching and relearning time. This is absolutely critical, and I think it's something that people have to be honest about. You have to be willing to re-examine how you schedule, how you use your time during the school day. There are 2 things that must be considered. One, reteaching, relearning time in some form or fashion is an imperative. Essentially, we are raising the bar for all students. No longer are we going to pass students forward with C's, D's. Instead, we are going to make sure that all of our students are proficient in what we expect them to learn in those standards. And if we're going to do that, you have to build some sort of bridge. You have to have meaningful reteaching, relearning time embedded in the school day. Really important schedule consideration. The other piece that we believe is important is time for professional learning for staff that's built into the day. Whether you call them professional learning communities and you follow the DeFore model, I've heard lately professional learning groups. It's important that you have meaningful time for teachers to collaborate during the day, to work on their practice, to talk about their students, to reflect and improve what they do. And along with that, it's not just the time in the day, but there's got to be professional development about how those meetings are going to be facilitated. That's an important piece. Sometimes it gets rushed through with the 4-point scale and the different conversion charts without having that time. And that's really connected to fostering and maintaining that shared vision.
And really, to be honest, that's one of the biggest hiccups that I've seen in schools. Oftentimes there's this sense amongst teachers that an initiative gets rolled out and it goes away, or you talk about it once or twice and then you don't talk about it again. This transition has to be with teachers, and we have to talk about it every single day. It has to be alive for them. Teachers will sometimes reject what they don't understand. The same is true of administrators. So it's really about implementing a schedule with embedded reteaching and relearning time. It's really about building a shared vision along with everyone in the community.
Right. And then finally, the last step really is finalizing the operational model for grading and reporting. What does your report card look like? What type of technology are you going to use? Learning management system. And these conversations happen prior to third or fourth year for sure. But we believe it's important that everything else is put in place before we actually go to grading and reporting. Other questions at this time?
None have been written in. Anne, do you have any questions?
I don't. You've been answering them along the way.
Yes. If anybody would like to be unmuted to ask a question directly, you can put up your hand and I can unmute you. So I'll give you a couple minutes. Dave and Chris, yep. Is there any more that you wanted to share?
I think a couple of points. One thing is, we're still very new to this school, and I think Dave said this at the beginning, that we're not offering some kind of silver bullet or step-by-step approach to how to do this. The reality is that this work is going to be different in every single school, and it's hard work. It really takes strong leadership and a commitment from everyone to get it done, and we're still very much we're in year one right now. So a lot of this stuff we're working toward. We're working on as we're presenting it.
Yep, and to reiterate that, if anyone wants to reach out to us, we do have our contact info there. We're happy to share documents with folks. We're happy to engage in dialogue either on the phone or virtually. And the invitation for a school visit and for reciprocal visits is certainly open.
Okay, that's great. And I just want to remind everybody that's on the call that as members of the consortium, you are welcome, of course, and you should reach out to Dave and Chris. You can also reach out through Ann and I. There was a question here about, are you willing to share, the question is, are you willing to share your report card? But I guess, based on your presentation, I'm not even sure is that something that you would want to share, because it's probably something that's very much in transition. It sounds like it's the final thing that you're working on.
Well, yes, it is. And so the short answer is yes, I do have something that I could share. If somebody would like to email me, I'd like to be in contact and just give you a little context for it. We certainly can do that. I think I mentioned last year we rolled out a standards-based report card that we then pulled back. So I can share that one, and I can provide some context as to why we actually pulled it back. We have not landed the plane on what our future report card will look like, because there's a lot of dialogue that we did not get into around how to actually, at the high school level, we're awarding credit for a course. So quite frankly, some of the discussion is, do students have to be proficient in all the standards in order to get credit in that course? Do they have to be proficient in a percentage of them, say 90% of the standards? Do we award them credit for a score something less than proficient? Do they get proficient for being at the progressing or 2 level? Do we use half points? And do we somehow arrive at a 2.5 and award credit, which is what most schools in the state of New Hampshire are doing? They're awarding credit for something that we believe is less than proficiency. It's either the 2 or the 2.5 level if they're averaging. Are we averaging? Are we averaging and if we are we averaging at the learning target level? Are we averaging at the standard level? Are we averaging our competencies in order to arrive at a single score for a course? Are we using the mode, the most frequently occurring number in the data set? Is that a more accurate measure? I believe that it is. But again, I'm going down the rabbit hole of all the questions that come up that need to be answered or need to be explored before you land the plane on that report card. So what we do is we pose these questions in a group, and we have sort of a think tank, and we throw ideas out about the best way to do it. And we have not figured that out yet. If anybody has any ideas, we're all ears.
The other part of that question is regarding the rest of your school district. So we have a lot of schools, and the principal that's writing in the question actually works at a 3 through 5 school. So what is the status with the rest of your district, A? And B, in terms of the transition district-wide, do you have any thoughts about sequence and communication and the district-wide transition?
So I think one of the things. So we came into a district that had already begun this work, and the same situation I had when I was in Maine, to be honest with you. And I think the piece that was missing in both districts was a lack of a district-wide vision for the work. It did not exist in either place where I did this work. And as a result, you end up with pockets. You end up with buildings going in different directions. And I think it's absolutely critical that there is some sort of district-wide steering committee that consists not only of stakeholders, but stakeholders who do have expertise and are committed to it. That's a piece that we were missing here. In our district, we have our middle school that's been reporting out on a 4-point scale. They do have a competency-based report card for a couple years now. We have one elementary school that has a traditional, believe it or not, a traditional 100-point scale, and another elementary school that's reporting out on a 4-point scale. Very, very difficult. As I said, last year, our freshman class had competency-based report cards. The rest of the school had a traditional one. And that caused all kinds of problems. It's part of the reason why we chose to slow it down. Really not slow it down. Really is just reassess and take a different direction with it. So I think there's got to be K-12 alignment for sure. And I think that schools who are more ready don't have to feel like they're being held back because they can focus on that teaching and learning realm and until the time is right for a district-wide transition to reporting.
And that's part of the emphasis on teaching and learning. Schools, districts seem to have a shared philosophy, shared vision, absolutely. But at the school level, the changes can and should come at the classroom level as teachers are ready to embrace the work.
Yeah. At the end of the day, whether you're reporting on a 4-point scale or a 100-point scale, that in and of itself will have no effect on student learning. But there are a lot of other things that we can do connected to this work that will have a profound effect on student learning. And those are the things that we chose to focus on, really.
That's a really good takeaway from the hour, because I think that's what you're trying to emphasize. That it's what happens in the classroom that's going to have the effect.
Absolutely. Yep. You have to consider the other factors as well, but there are some big questions that are not answered. In my personal opinion, I believe the most accurate way to report out on this is to report out on the percentage of standards, the number of standards students have met or exceeded in a given course. That way you get a single grade for a course. You don't have multiple competency grades, but you can dig down in the data to determine exactly which standards kids have and have not met. And you can have a number that is familiar to parents and somewhat more palatable than the 4-point scale that we see often.
And that's at the high school level where you sort of feel an obligation to generate a grade or a single number.
A single number at the high school level, likely what will happen here is we will end up giving 3 to 5 scores for each course. We'll end up reporting out at the competency level. But the trick at the high school is, when do you award course credit? What criteria are you going to use to award students credit? And does that mean they have to be proficient in all of the standards in a course? Does that mean they have to be proficient in a certain percentage of those standards in a course? Or again, do you award credit for some score, something less than proficiency? I advise against that. I think a lot of schools are doing that, and I think the end result is, we're still moving kids forward when they haven't learned all the material as we expect them to. And I think we need to focus on making sure kids have learned what we expect them to.
And the way that schools have really answered this in New Hampshire so far is through a conversion. Converting the 100-point to a 4-point scale. Some even take those numbers out and just call them names. But there's still numbers behind it. There's still averaging going on behind it. And the reality is, for many schools, you have 180 school days, you have grade levels, you have bells that ring, you have scheduled classes that go into it. So that's one of the major reasons that the operational model comes in at the end. We want to change what's going on in the classroom before we flip the switch. Because when you do flip the switch, that's when you're going to get people from all over. They're going to realize that there's a big change, and some may question it too.
Okay, so the takeaway is make the changes in the classroom before you flip the switch. That's great.
Absolutely, and certainly place the emphasis on teaching and learning.
Okay. We need to close now. We're starting to have some attrition, I'm noticing in our attendees. So I am going to close the meeting, and I would encourage everyone to contact Dave and Chris or Ann and I with any questions, and hopefully folks from this meeting will maybe have an opportunity to see you again at our full-day conference. And I just want to thank you both very much. It was terrific, and we look forward to another one soon.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you, Karen.
All right, so thanks much.
Take care.
Take care.